I think I'm going to kick off because I'm respectful of your time and don't want you to be sitting around waiting. If others join along the way and they've missed something, we can always go back to the recording or recap afterwards. So let me start. Thank you for joining. Thank you for being prompt. Good morning and welcome to today's webinar about assessing leadership capabilities and readiness. For those who've not met me before, I think we've all kind of exchanged in some way before, but I'm Matthew Emerson. I'm Managing Director at Blackmore 4 and I'm the host for this morning's webinar. I'm going to be sharing our thoughts, Blackmore 4 thoughts on the topic of leadership assessment. As I've started off already, I'm happy for this to be quite an informal session. If you've got questions, contributions to make, we can discuss that as we go. I'm also planning on leaving plenty of time within the hour if we want to get to the end and then have some further discussion or questions after that. However you want to participate, if you want to be on mute and off the video, you can do that. Engage as you will. This is just a 1 hour session on this topic for you to get what you want and can out of it. Likewise, as I said, I am recording the session so that we can share it with people who've registered and are interested, but unfortunately haven't been able to attend. For that reason, I would say if there's any specific topics that you think are sensitive, you'd rather discuss offline, not in the webinar itself, then feel free to pick up with myself or one of the team afterwards, and we can have that conversation as an extension of this. Today's agenda can be quite fluid, and I guess depending on where the conversation goes, we'll follow the crowd if you like. But the information I was planning on running through is just to quickly recap on our perspective of leadership and the topic of leadership needs as a precursor to assessment. We've talked about these things in articles and on webinars previously, so I don't plan to spend a lot of time re-clarifying our position on those topics, but I think it's useful context. And then we'll talk a bit about the principles of leadership assessment, the methods, relatively sort of fundamental methods of assessing leadership and some of the ways in which you can tackle that. And then this notion of assessing leadership readiness, and I'll outline a few different scenarios that I think that frequently comes up in conversation and again, just some of our thoughts on that topic. If there's other things you were hoping to get from this session or you thought we were going to cover, then as I say, by all means, ask along the way or we can discuss further at the end. Assuming that's all clear, let me kick off. What is leadership? So as I say, we've written a fairly lengthy piece on this. I'm not planning to spend a long time. Before we get to the topic of leadership assessment, what it is we're assessing. And in many ways, leadership is hard to pin down. There are many different definitions of leadership, often used in the same way as the word management, and we've talked a bit about that previously. But the way we see it is a distinct, a very specific set of capabilities and behaviours that determine and drive the purpose, values and direction of an organisation. That in itself is probably also too simple to really get us, bridge the gap between what we understand to be leadership and assessing it. But within that, what we typically carved out before are 4 elements that we believe are specific definitions of leadership. Leadership being contextual, something that happens within a business environment, and therefore we think it's specific to the circumstances of a particular business, not necessarily a universal one-size-fits-all type of concept. Relational, we believe it's about relationships and involves the influencing of others' behaviours. We've also said it's anchored to a destination, whether that be a broad vision of where the business is heading, a specific underlying purpose or very specific goals. Most leadership happens in the context of trying to get somewhere. And then this shared process of inspiring action. So as much as it's about a relationship, the relationship that is intended to have an action and reaction and consequences to that. So some form of impact through your behaviour that will hopefully get you to your destination. Now, again, we could talk about this for another couple of hours and say what is leadership and various aspects, but I think this is the context that we come at leadership from. It is complicated, and in order to assess leadership, we try and boil it down to something more specific, which is why when we talk about the specific set of skills or a specific set of attributes, what we would advise is that we normally get there first in terms of identifying, for your business, what is leadership? What are the needs for your business? What is going to make an impact? And this summary kind of, maybe is a platform for doing that needs analysis. So once we've clearly defined leadership, and again, in your business, in your experience, it may have some slightly different definition. We think those previous 4 elements of leadership are quite important. But whatever definition you're using, whatever you think leadership is in your business, we also then recommend this needs analysis. In conversation, it sort of seems so obvious. Why would you be assessing and developing leadership if you haven't yet figured out what the leadership needs are of your business? But in my experience, and I think most people I talk to, the eagerness to get onto sort of either assessing leadership capability or certainly even further developing further leadership capability often seems to be in the absence of this first step, which is the leadership needs analysis. So again, we've talked about this previously, but really having an objective perspective based on what you are trying to achieve as a business, to translate that into some very specific leadership needs. And that might be skills-based, it might be behavioral-based, but having something that you feel is important for your business rather than just a generic definition or framework of leadership that may or may not apply directly to your business. So for us, getting clear on what we mean when we say leadership, but also conducting thorough and objective leadership needs analysis is important on the route to making sure that leadership assessment is effective. And if you've joined us previously or you've read any of our articles, you'll know what I've already said is our position on this. So then we get to the topic of leadership assessment. And as I was preparing for this webinar and as we sort of wrote on this topic, I can't escape the fact that the word assessment terrifies people. Maybe not terrifies people, but it certainly doesn't make people feel comfortable. And this picture that we use for leadership assessment is for me spot on. We're putting a magnifying glass against people, and naturally human behavior, human emotions, if you like, react against that. The best picture I could find to help me convey that message was one of a tortoise. So, you know, I know when I've been assessed before, and having spoken to a few people, there's a sense of whether it be performance anxiety or we call it imposter syndrome, whatever that thing is, that makes us feel like I don't really want somebody coming looking at what I'm capable of doing for fear that maybe I'm not capable or that I'll be judged or in some way that's going to have some negative consequence. So I'll hide, I'll try not to do the assessment, or I should have found a different picture for this, or I'll put on some artificial front and try and almost game the assessment. So the other reaction we might have, as opposed to hiding from it or at least being fearful of it, the behavioural reaction might be one of I'm going to play it, I'll engage, but I may not engage in a genuine way. So leadership assessment, any assessment of any kind actually, but specifically leadership assessment is hard in that respect, because you have to be sensitive and you have to accept and acknowledge the fact that the word in itself, before you even get onto the process, the activity that you're conducting, is not likely to immediately engage people in the activity. And there's a number of things that play into that, but knowing that, there's a set of principles and a few methods that I was going to cover today. I think we just need to be conscious of that impact of the word assessment and the nature of it as we talk through how we would approach leadership assessment. And the principles, I think, frame everything. So regardless of how you go about doing your assessment, for us, it's important to be clear on the principles of what are you trying to achieve and how you conduct effective assessments, rather than just wandering in, let's say, to an assessment phase without thinking about these specific things. If I just pause for a second before I run through these principles, at the moment, I think, given context all around us, leadership assessment in our experience is not just likely to be prevalent. I think there's a lot of business leaders who are looking around assessing, do we have the right leadership capability in the business to go forward? Our forward position may have changed. Certainly the operating context has changed. So I think the activity of leadership assessment may be on the increase, but also that fear factor of being assessed may also be on the increase, given the potential landscape of economic recession and redundancies, you know, in the macro picture. People may well tie the two things together. in our view, we would typically undertake leadership assessment work in a slightly more positive landscape. And even if the world around us is not feeling that, our perspective on leadership assessment is it gives a perfect basis from which to understand how we can develop and how we can grow and how we can be more effective towards, as I said earlier, towards the goals or ambitions or vision we have for our business. So I'm not talking about leadership assessment in the context of trying to find not very good leaders or weak leaders or people who perhaps shouldn't be in leadership positions and identifying them as people who should be leaving our organisation. We would typically talk about leadership assessment, as I say, in a slightly more positive frame, really try to identify where there might be gaps against what you need and then finding ways of closing those gaps. So on that basis, when we think about effective assessments, we think about these sort of three core principles. And I think the first one you could extend from being objective and conducting an assessment in a way that is fair and free from bias. I think that in itself needs to be explicit, needs to be felt by participants so that they don't feel that this is in some way a sort of covert way of uncovering their skills gaps or their weaknesses. But I think also what adds to that is a level of independence. So being objective can be achieved within an organisation, but in some cases the participants in the assessment may still feel there is bias there, and they may well be right. To make some form of leadership assessment from within, from people who already know the individuals participating, still doesn't necessarily give participants the confidence they need to know that this is for the right reasons and going to be conducted in an independent way as much as an objective way. So we may well focus on the objectivity of assessment. That's key for effectiveness, but to try and help with some of the fear factor in that, it may well also help for it to be conducted independently. The second point, and actually the second and third point, reliable and valid assessments are key throughout any form of psychological assessment. Specifically when we're talking about leadership assessment, what we really mean here is making sure that when it goes back to a little bit to the needs analysis, but when we're assessing leaders, we're actually assessing in a way that gives us reliability across, numbers of leaders across a team, number of leaders across an organisation, number of people we may not even have identified as leaders, but as we're assessing, we're generating results that we can rely on, that we don't have to second guess, or we don't have to sort of take a long stretch to be able to interpret. And then specifically in terms of the validity of that data, making sure that the things that we're actually trying to assess are being assessed. And I think getting those two things right, assessing the things we're hoping to assess, that the tools, the activities we're using are based on some sound foundations and can be replicated, gives us the confidence of it being meaningful, driving the outcomes that you're hoping for, but also gives an element of respect again to the objectivity of what you're trying to do, rather than making it subjective and feel like a sort of judgment on the individuals participating. I'm just going to pause and sorry, because I'm sort of looking at a couple of different split screens. If people do have questions at that stage, feel free to shout out and interrupt me, because otherwise I'll just carry on speaking over you. And if I don't hear anything, then I'll carry on.
That's fine. I'm happy.
Thanks, Steve. So on the foundation of some clear principles, and I think it's important that again, in our experience, rather than spending time writing a whole set of principles around what makes effective assessment, for us those three key principles are the bedrock of leadership assessment, of any kind of psychological assessment. We then go on to the activity, and I think I'll use my personal experience. I feel like over the course of my career, leadership assessment has taken on this sort of almost magical, mythical sort of presence. There's some certainly there's some science to it, there's some expertise to it, but in a way, the things that we do to assess leadership are no different than the things we would do necessarily to assess in any other sort of context. And so when I look at this list and I say, well, we might use interviews or tests, focus groups, or some form of observation, we might use those things to assess in a hiring process, not necessarily for leaders, but specifically, but for people that we want to join our organisation. So I think the lines And this I'll talk a bit more about when we come onto sort of leadership readiness and the notion of what it means to be ready for leadership. I think the lines here tend to get a bit blurred. And I say that just because I can almost feel a potential question that says, well, yeah, these activities are just kind of normal assessment activities. Well, they are. Actually, it's more important that we get to grips with the content of what we're assessing for, the needs of the business, and couple that with some robust assessment techniques, let's say. So let's just talk specifically about each one of these. I think most of us have been through interviews, so I don't think I need to explain what an interview is, but I think, again, in our experience, much less used for the purpose of assessing leadership capability than they are in the normal course of events for assessing candidates if we're hiring, for example. And yet, we sort of expect, therefore, that either people in formal positions of leadership or potentially people we expect to take on a leadership role just sort of do it in a way that hopefully that they're skilled to do, that they behave in a way that is aligned with our business. But if we're really trying to assess leadership capabilities, then there are certain interview techniques, typically structured interview techniques, well prepared, well delivered, carefully managed in terms of the evaluation of the data provided, that can give us a real insight into somebody's leadership experience and also then their skills and likely behaviours. Now, in the same way that an interview through a hiring process still has its limitations, be that an interview in assessing leadership capabilities also has its limitations. So it's important to be aware of that. But if we're conducting leadership assessments, if we're trying to assess, take a wider sort of view on this, either at a personal level, I'm trying to assess my own leadership capabilities, or we're trying to assess at an organizational level the sort of capabilities we have as a whole. Actually structured, well thought through, prepared, consistent interviewing techniques could be really helpful. Now, the limitation clearly from a practical point of view is on scale. If you're trying to work at scale, if you're trying to get across an organisation and say, well, actually, we want to uncover the leadership capabilities in our entire organisation, then it's going to get quite time consuming to do interviews with every individual if you're involved in a big organisation. But I think we often overlook the power of an interview, power of a structured interview particularly. And what we typically say about hiring, although we tend not to get involved in hiring so much, is that to complement an interview, a good way to do that, a good way to get some different type of insight, is through a simple test. And in the same way that assessment might, technical phrase, scare the bejesus out of somebody, the word test has similar impact. I appreciate that. So if I'm being assessed or I'm being tested, I'm not sure I have a different emotional reaction to those two things, but people will do. When I use the word test, I mean a specific artifact that has been developed and is considered to be reliable and valid in assessing a specific thing. And that might be some cognitive ability, it might be personality, it might be emotional intelligence as an example. For me, the application of a psychometric test within the context of doing some form of assessment is quite powerful. Now, again, limited on its own, it will give you a valid, clear perspective, but it has some element of bias creep in as the user's completing it, especially if we've got experienced leaders completing some form of psychometric assessment. They'll, again, as I said earlier, potentially be leaning towards gaming that system, whether it's intentional or not. They may answer as they're expecting people to see it rather than as it's genuinely how they feel or behave. But in working in tandem between a structured interview and a test, for example, which, as I say, is what we often recommend, you increase the data and the perspectives, if you like, of where that data's come from to make a slightly more rounded, slightly more objective assessment in total. Where we've come across skepticism for psychometric testing particularly is where tests have been, I would say, misapplied. There are many tests, psychometric tests, in the world, some of which you can access free or for very little money, and may or may not be assessing the thing you want to assess, and may or may not be valid and reliable. So I think, again, there's an element of expertise in both selecting the right tool, but then applying and managing the testing environment and the test completion to make sure that objectivity remains, that it's as free from bias as possible, and that it gives you the results you're intending to get. I was going to say looking for, not the results you're looking for, but the results that were going to be as accurate as possible for you to make some decisions. As we put here, I think that's complementary insight rather than as advocating a specific psychometric test being the single way of assessing leadership capability in your organisation. And something I'm quite keen on doing, but again, appreciate there's some practicality challenges in doing this, especially at the moment. We've sort of gone by an era of sending surveys out and thinking that we can ask a series of questions, get a series of answers, and it gives us partly an extended set of data, but also probably a richer set of data from which to analyse and glean some outcomes. But I think there's a general, and I think this is generally across business, but it probably goes beyond business as well, fatigue of surveys. And I think we've realised from a psychological perspective, but I think consulting as well, that surveys have severe limitations to them. I think the effort to try and make sure that the questions are being asked in a thorough, specific and valid way, that they get answers that kind of make sense, is time consuming. I think the administrative burden around survey completion can sometimes be distracting. So for me, actually, although it may not get to the scale of a survey, it may not have the ease of management, let's say, of sending out a survey, focus groups provide a more powerful way of getting that wider data set that we're looking for. Now, clearly they require some quite specific, and again, usually independent for effectiveness, usually independent facilitation skills. But if we can run focus groups, include a greater number of people and get some observations back that way, it gives us the ability to not just get feedback, but also drive a little bit of momentum in conversation, a bit of energy in the room, and also the opportunity to clarify. I think the fundamental challenge I've had with surveys in the past is I get data and I really want to ask them follow-up questions to understand the data. Unfortunately, I don't have the people in front of me, and I don't have the luxury of being able to go back on a second survey all the time and do that again. So although, as I say, it's maybe reducing the scope of people involved from maybe where you would be with a survey, actually, I think the richness, the context of the data, and the potential for that to give to someone's or a collection of people's leadership capability is quite powerful. And if at all possible, and this is where we really get into sensitive territory, where people are quite reluctant to feel observed, let's say. Certainly, we're not talking about a test lab or anything like that. But if you're in a position where you are running a business and you have a team of people around you who you consider to be a leadership team, or you've identified a group of people who you would expect to be showing some form of relevant leadership capability, then again, with some preparation, with some expertise in thinking through how you're going to collect your data, separate to analysing and evaluating that data, spending time in what I call a natural company of leaders, so not in an artificial environment, not necessarily third-party information, but trying to actually see for yourself what happens when certain things happen in certain circumstances can be really key, because all of the other stuff is either scripted or in dialogue about what do you do if you're able to observe, if you're able to at least get some examples of things that have actually happened, then again, this is context rich, it's in the business environment, and it gives you probably a step further insight into somebody's natural leadership capabilities. And it may be, depending on the size of your organisation and team, it may be that you can do that over a period of time with a number of people without it feeling like a burdensome exercise, and without it feeling like everybody's permanently under scrutiny. So again, we can talk about that a bit further if that's something of interest. But these four things together, I certainly wouldn't necessarily expect any business to be going through all 4 mechanisms to complete an assessment. For sure, that might give you the most rounded view, but it's probably not necessary. But one on their own is probably also insufficient. So trying to assess leadership through one means, depending on what type of leadership you're looking at, depending on what you're really trying to get out of the exercise, I would suggest that just using one mechanism is likely to have limitations. And the insight you get from that, I guess, is more subject to challenge or questioning than if you're able to eloquently, if you like, combine two approaches in a way that gives the participants and yourself some confidence in what's being assessed and the outcome of that assessment. I'm going to pause for a second before I jump into this notion of leadership readiness, because this may take us off on a slight tangent. Don't know if anybody's got any questions on what I've just said.
Matthew, I've got a point on about observation.
Yeah.
I think actually, although it's maybe the most scary and the one that you've just highlighted is maybe the most intrusive, but actually it's the only one that really sees an individual perform on the job in those moments that matter. And I think that under pressure, which is where leadership happens day in, day out, that's the only moment we're really going to see it truly in action, truly being demonstrated. I just wondered if you wanted to speak to that a bit more.
I think that's right. I think that's the sort of most accurate portrayal of what's really happening. I think the difficulty is you don't know when it's going to happen. So short of putting somebody under permanent observation, you know, as you said, leadership happens when it happens, right? Either under pressure or when something unexpected turns up. So this is why I think it's important with all of these, actually, not just to think, right, we're going to do this one, off we go, let's look at how somebody behaves, you know, on Tuesday or, you know, at 3 o'clock on a Thursday when we think something might happen, but actually to take some careful preparation. What is it we're looking for? What is it we're trying to see? What do we value? What sort of conditions, example conditions, are we trying to detect that behavior or a set of leadership skills? So I think it's right. Yeah, I agree with exactly what you're saying. It is the single most natural, if you like, environment to try and assess leadership. I still think it needs to come with some element of pre-planning to get it right. I think in terms of the scary nature of it, I think the word observation, again, a lot of this is down to words and how we interpret them. Get that magnifying glass out. I don't think of observation being about, you know, following somebody around for the day, checking on what they're doing. But again, I think carefully crafted periods of time, certain environments. It may, in my experience, it may just be a lot of businesses, like it or not, run a sort of structured leadership meeting or some form like that. It may be being a natural participant in those meetings, but with an eye on how do you react when somebody says this, or, you know, again, in a sort of pre-planned way, being able to observe that without the specific situation being set up for the purposes of observing leadership, if that makes sense.
I did. Yeah, thank you.
So this idea of leadership readiness, I wrestled with this because we've talked about this in terms of how do you not just assess leadership, but somebody's readiness for leadership. And I think the readiness element throws up a number of different questions. I think in some ways, when we talk about leadership readiness, we're almost making it too complex. I think we're actually meaning we're just assessing somebody's leadership capabilities. It may be that they're not formally in a leadership role. That doesn't necessarily mean they're not already leaders. And so I was trying to break this down into what do we really mean by a leader's readiness? And these were the 4 elements I kind of thought were potentially useful. So you may already be leading. And when I say leading, it might be that you have a formal position of being a leader or a manager, but people look to you in whatever capacity you have to lead. It may be that you're leading more informally, but But fundamentally, point one is that you may or may not be ready for what the future holds. So I think for me, fundamental to leadership readiness is not about personally, have I got, tick, 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 the right leadership for this business, but actually a more specific reference to what are we anticipating or what can't we anticipate about our future, and how ready am I as an individual, or are we, more importantly, collectively, for whatever the future may hold. So I think there is an angle to this, which is, and I won't apologise if I keep going back to the needs analysis, but I think there is an element of this that keeps going back to what do you want from this thing we call leadership going forward. Let's not sort of focus our assessment on history per se, but what actually are we trying to achieve, and what does being ready to lead in the future really look like? For me, the actual process approach to assessing leadership in that context is no different, but it's being much more specific on the anchors, if you like, for leadership needs in your business. I think the other thing that came to my mind that I heard I think it was last week, was that somebody's potentially leading, they are ready to lead, but they're not aligned. So if I think about it as these first 2 points as one almost being a vertical axis or a front running axis, if you like, from now to the future, the alignment for me is a bit of a horizontal barometer. I may well be ready to lead into the future, but my vision of the future may be a bit different to my colleagues. And that's quite critical, because from an intended recipient of leadership, I kind of need some consistency, especially now, more now than ever before. It's important that we make sure that collectively we're ready to lead, and that implies some amount of consistency. That doesn't mean individuals shouldn't be individuals. That doesn't mean we all lead in the same way, but there needs to be a heavy amount of alignment in what we're leading to and what people can expect of our leadership. How are we going to behave in particular set of circumstances, and are we going to do that in a way that people can rely and depend on our leadership, or are we going to do that in a way that is easily fragmented and misaligned when the pressure comes? As Simon was saying, a lot of leadership happens in pressured moments. How do we know that's going to be aligned and consistent across the team? So for me, again, that is maybe starts to touch on, do we have the right skills and behaviours? Do we have the right leadership capability in the organisation? But it also picks out the issue of having individuals within that organisation who maybe look to as leaders, but maybe not ready to lead in the way that we think is necessary in the business. I think I'm straying now from assessing leadership readiness from this concept of you're a future leader, you're a potential leader, or an emerging leader. I hear these terms all the time, to actually just recognising that people are leaders, whether we grant them that authority or formality or not. But in many cases, they're not ready for leading in the future. They may not be aligned with the leadership needs of the business. And in that informality, they may be leading, but never recognised as leading. And this may have positive effect on your business if you've got many people who are aligned, who are ready for the future. They are actually leading others in your organisation. Not recognising that doesn't mean it goes away, but they are typically the people that we sort of start tagging as future leaders. They may be the people that don't sit in your formal leadership team meetings, but probably are having more of an influence on people's behaviour, possibly than the people that do sit in those meetings. So I think there's an element of this about, when are people ready to be formally anointed, if you like, as a leader in this business? And actually, do you need to do that? Because in many cases that I've seen, when somebody stops being part of the team and becomes a manager typically, but a sort of formally appointed leader, let's say, actually the impact that they have on their colleagues changes, because you've changed the dynamic of the relationship. So in some ways, assessing leadership readiness really needs to stretch beyond this sort of formal structure of a leadership team, because actually you might have a lot of leadership capability and a lot of influence in the sort of unknown or certainly untagged leaders in the organisation. So there's certainly three sources of leadership potentially, or at least three combinations of leadership that are happening that may not be fit for where you're heading. but that you may want to get a really good assessment of to determine whether there's further action you can take, whether it be development, and actually whether some of it leads into not just leadership development sort of at a personal level, maybe not even a team level, but actually organizationally, do we need to change things around so that we can get more from the people who are having the greatest leadership impact. And then the final one is, I think, perhaps where we more traditionally look at leadership readiness, which is they're perhaps not leading, never been asked to lead, perhaps don't naturally lead, but something in our observation of them or something in what they're doing suggests they have potential, and that difference between having the potential to lead but perhaps not naturally leading at the moment may be caused by a number of things. It might be caused by the operating context, the circumstances in your business, maybe something about their own characteristics or traits that's getting in their way, if you like. So there is some validity in trying to assess that potential beyond the people that you can see are already leading. The reason I started this saying it could take us off in many different tangents, because I think the concept of assessing leadership readiness goes well beyond that idea of, you know, who are the next set of leaders, and I think it is as complex as leadership as a topic is more broadly. So if you are thinking about your future and trying to assess leadership readiness in your organization, I think it's important to be very clear what are we trying to be ready for, and in what context are we assessing leadership readiness. I don't think I can say leadership readiness any more time, so I'm going to move on unless people have got any urgent questions. And this was my way of trying to summarize these themes and say, yeah, fundamentally, leadership is a team sport. We've said on a few occasions, this isn't really about individuals, although of course individuals make up the team, make up the organization. But fundamentally, we need to detach this from being about, am I good enough? Am I the leader? Am I going to ever be that type of leader? And actually starts really playing out the idea that leadership is a critical role, but it's an organizational attribute, and that if assessment is conducted fairly and in a way that promotes participation rather than puts people in places of isolation or makes them feel like they're being judged or labeled, then we're likely as a group, as a business, as an organization, to get clearer, better results from which we can develop. So effective leadership assessment really has to start from the premise of, I really understand what we're trying to do, what we're trying to assess, we know the needs of the business, and we can conduct the assessment in a fair way that's free from bias, but in a way that's going to give us meaningful results, that we can be confident that if we pursue some additional leadership development, or we in extremes decide to change the way we're organized to make full use of our leadership capability, that's based on valid data and reliable data, and we can be confident in those decisions. And I say leadership is a team sport a lot, maybe even more than I say leadership readiness, but I think that's an important shift that through assessment we need to get to, that we get away from people feeling anxious that they're being assessed, that we accept a level of, call it performance anxiety or imposter syndrome or whatever scariness happens beneath, we accept that, but we move away from it by acknowledging this kind of collective responsibility for leading rather than putting every emphasis for leadership on individual. And every time we do a webinar, we try and be very clear about why this is relevant. I said earlier, I think the notion of having people you can look to steer your direction, people you can trust to take you forward, is as important now as it has ever been. It's really hard to see 6 months ahead, 12 months ahead in many cases. So we look to leaders to give us confidence and to give us clarity. Whether we know the leadership capabilities of our organisation or not is key to how successful we're going to be going forward. Because if people are looking to that thing called leadership, we need to be crystal clear on what kind of leadership we think is going to take our business forward in a positive way, and then get super clear on which capabilities we have in abundance and which are in short supply. So for us at Blackmore 4, we talk a lot about organisational effectiveness. For leadership to be effective, we have to clearly assess it. We have to clearly assess it on the basis of our needs. And at that point, I will stop talking. And if there are questions, I can't even see if there's a bunch more people joined or whether it's still just the 4 of us. But I will flip my screen in a second and have a look to see if anybody has anything to contribute. Comments are welcome as well. If you completely disagree with anything I've said, that's absolutely fine. We welcome the debate. Otherwise, yeah, if you've got questions, I'm happy to take them.
I think that, sorry, I'm hearing myself. I think one of the toughest things is you've hit on, which is the best way of finding out if people can be leaders is you put them into the position. And yet, if you put them in the position, you often then find out that some of them who you thought were going to be good leaders aren't. And I guess you're saying it's about how do you create that system where you can at least test that out so you don't make those mistakes. You know, we've all seen the put your best salesman as a sales manager, and before you know it, you've got the worst manager and then more best salesman. Yeah,
and I think within that, exactly, the example's a good one, and I've seen it many times over with different functions. It's not always the salespeople that are bad leaders. But
sorry,
no, but whichever function, I agree. That example gets played out all the time. I think there are two things within that. I don't think you need somebody to be in a so-called leadership role to be able to assess their leadership capabilities. So although by being in a leadership role, it probably gives us an increased opportunity. I think the spotlight's on and everybody knows that that person's expected to lead. Before you get to that stage, I think this idea of assessing somebody's leadership capabilities in the absence of the experience of being in a role, I think we sort of need to detach those two things, because I've seen plenty of people who, regardless of their role, demonstrate to me what I would think of to be leadership qualities, let's say attributes. So I think that we do need to get more creative. I think we all need to get more creative in thinking about what examples of leadership could I see that may be translated into being in a formal leadership role, rather than having to sort of, as you say, put them in the role hoping that my guess or my intuition or whatever has been right, and then find out that actually they were really good at their last job, but they're not really meant for this one. The second thing then that may start straying into some more detail, but is whether or not you need people in leadership roles at all. So you know, that designation of this person is really good at I think is going to be a really good leader, or I think would be right for that leadership role. You could certainly do some assessment of them beforehand. But to my point about when you put somebody into a role, you then lose some of their impact, because I think there is something to be said about peer-to-peer leadership. People will follow their colleagues and either replicate behaviours or adjust their own behaviours based on what they're seeing of an influential colleague, as much as they're possibly going to do that of somebody in a formally appointed role. So the salesperson may already be having a positive leadership effect without actually carrying a leadership badge, if that makes sense. So I think it's worth, again, thinking of it in a slightly wider frame of leadership as a team attribute, an organizational attribute. What are we actually trying to get to, rather than as individuals in roles? But before I apply that to every business, obviously, depending on your business, depending on your team setup, it may be that the more structured, if you like, formality of leadership makes sense. I think there's just a couple of different ways of looking at that.
Yeah, I think from personal experience, you know, coming through a large firm and then becoming a partner, is that they wanted to send you away for a year and a half for a secondment, where you effectively kind of get put into a leadership role on a project basis.
Yeah.
And it's that sort of thing. So you don't actually get a title. You know, you're still a manager working for the National Leadership Board, and you then have teams of partners working for you. It's really kind of quite odd, but also quite liberating, because they all want to. They know what the goal is, and it gives you a chance to sort of lead a project, and other people are, you know, for a fact, are assessing you, because they report back at the end of your year and a half, and it all goes into your partner appraisal process. So I'm not saying you'd be able to send everyone on a year and a half, but there are plenty of projects where people can demonstrate the leadership. You know, we have audit seniors. They go out on projects and every 2 weeks or every week, leading a team of 1 or 2 or 3 people. So it's about capturing all of that data that's difficult, isn't it? To let you know, and getting the feedback from people as you go.
I was just going to say that. I think it sort of spills into what Simon was saying about observation. You know, in the moment, real life. You know, that's where leadership happens. Yes, the challenge with doing the secondment, whether it's 6 months, 18 months, whatever it is again, I think a lot of this comes back to clarity beforehand in terms of what it is you're looking for, to be able to set up the mechanisms to make sure that that data comes back and can be objectively analysed, rather than, and again, forgive me because my experiences are probably quite different to yours, but in secondment terms, rather than just at the end of the secondment saying, actually, one of the reasons we wanted to do that was to assess their potential, leadership potential, and maybe taking one source of feedback as a way of determining that. So I think it's doing it by design rather than potentially doing it almost by accident at the end.
Yeah, I mean, with a comment like that, it was pretty crystal clear, which is, we think you've got partner potential. You're going to go away for 12 to 18 months and see how much that potential you can have in what would be a relatively safe environment for that firm. But you're right, you've got to have a proper plan, and you never quite know how it will pan out, or which projects are going to arise in 18 months. But you can do it on a much smaller scale, I think, with shorter term projects. But
and again, I think it fit for purpose, right? So depending on which environment you're working in and what you're trying to get out of it, I think should dictate, if you like, that the right approach. The only other thing I'd comment on, I guess, is in partnership organisations. Again, we tend to almost assume the leadership responsibilities or the leadership role that a partner has, because most people are familiar with the nature of a partner organisation and you know, the aspiration that people have to become a partner. But in a changing world and potentially a changing business landscape, depending on which industry we refer to, pinning down actually what you want, what you need your partners to be doing in a leadership context. Now, partners typically in my reference point, you know, bringing in revenue is a key part of being a partner. Being a mentor and guiding light, let's say, for people who are still, you know, at earlier stages of their career is quite key. But specifically, what leadership needs do we have of our partnership group? How big is the partnership group? Are they all expected to be doing the same things? For me, that really takes us back to sort of the beginning of leadership needs analysis. What is that? And using that as a basis to then go into what you were describing. Okay, so then if we're assessing people's readiness to be a partner or readiness to take on a leadership role, what specifically are we looking for? And again, I'm not criticising any organisation in particular, not specific to your point, Steve, about partnership organisations, but there is a lack of detail in many organisations about what that role specifically is expected to do in the context of leadership, that would help both the incumbents but also the people who aspire to be partners get clearer sight of their development needs or the development opportunities. And again, I agree, secondments are a great way to structure some of that, because it's real experience and it's hopefully real insight.
And if I have one sort of final, I think the challenge is, you know, I mean, I was at a 250, nearly 300 partner firm, which is very different from where I am now, which is 25 partner. But even when you break it down by office, if you have 5 partners who are all the same with the same leadership styles, that ain't going to work. Which is what I think you were alluding to about leadership is teamwork. It's about recognising the strengths that each of you has in different areas.
Absolutely, and I think not being the same. I mean, I appreciate it could happen. When we scratch beneath the surface, I suspect even in that 5 example, there are quite some differences in individual personalities and skills, etc. But again, you're right. If there is a need of leadership in your business, and I often use communication as an example because it gets banded around as a sort of important leadership skill. But if there are people in your leadership team, in your 5 people, who just aren't that good at communicating, rather than beating them up about it, rather than beating themselves up about it, let's just be clear that that's important and they don't do it that well. But if there are 4 other people in that team who are really good at the specific communication you're talking about, why would you beat him up about it, or him or her about it, and why would it become an important thing for them individually if collectively you've got that skill in abundance? That's the I guess one of the angles I take at that point.
I think
I think difference is important and helps it in a team sport context, and you can draw on strengths rather than people feeling again isolated or labelled for what they would perceive to be kind of skills gaps or weaknesses. Thanks for that, Steve. I appreciate it.
Well, it comes with I think your point was really made earlier. You can't assess everyone against the same criteria because the leadership is so broad.
Yes.
Yeah, there's core sets of skills which I think you outlined, but it's then which other bits do you spike in? So there are some amazing leaders who spike all over the place, but most of us probably spike in a couple of areas that suit us, and it's about how you blend that team together when you're trying to get the right board or whatever. You need to have that range. But we've covered that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Any other observations or questions? Conscious we're probably running up to the hour. I've got about 5 minutes left. No, okay. Like if people want to follow up afterwards, as I said, more than happy for you to contact us personally or on our sort of contact at email address. We've got more content on our website, blackmore4.co.uk, in the form of short blogs, lengthy articles. We'll be sending out the slides and the materials just to give you a bit of a nudge on your memory. We've got our next webinar on the 17th of November. We've got a new colleague joining the team. I'm hoping he's going to lead the next webinar. But that's going to be on leadership development. So you'll start to get the theme. We've talked a bit about leadership needs analysis. We've covered assessment today. Next month, 17th November, we're going to talk more about leadership development, and details are on our website, and we'll be sending out information about that shortly. Otherwise, thank you for joining. Hope it's been of use and provided some insight. Look forward to seeing you or speaking to you all again soon. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye now.